Hey guys, welcome to Sports Spectrum. Today's episode is presented by Compassion International. Check them out at fillthestadium.com. We're talking about COVID-19 running rampant, especially to those that Compassion serves, the children that Compassion International stands in the gap for. 70,000 kids and their families needing urgent support. And this is where you and I can step up. And we've been telling you about Compassion's Fill the Stadium initiative, and we're happy to report that more than 61, almost 62,000 seats of this 70,000 seat stadium of children that we're trying to save, more than 62,000 seats now have been filled due to your generosity with Compassion International. But we still have quite a long ways to go, and we need your help to provide essential food, medical care, and support for a child and their family during this pandemic. Check out fillthestadium.com to donate today. This is a stadium that cannot remain empty. fillthestadium.com.
Welcome to Sports Spectrum, where we bring Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, former ESPN producer Jason Romano.
And welcome to the show. I am Jason, and this is the Sports Spectrum podcast. We're so glad that you're tuning in today. Make sure you check out our website, sportspectrum.com, for all of our content, articles, devotionals, podcasts, all available right there at the website, sportspectrum.com. It's all free, and you can sign up right now for our weekly newsletter as well. When you click that newsletter icon at the top, you can put in your email address, and you can sign up for Sports Spectrum's weekly newsletter for free into your inbox. Once a week, we update you and keep you posted on all the happenings at Sports Spectrum and our ministry with all the podcasts and devotionals and articles that you may have missed. You can sign up right there. Click the newsletter icon at sportspectrum.com. Now, today, we have quite the conversation with David Klingler. Now, if you're a kid of the 80s and 90s who loved football like I did, David Klingler's name is someone synonymous with the NFL and certainly with college football. David was selected 6th overall in the 1992 NFL draft by the Cincinnati Bengals after a standout career in college at the University of Houston, particularly in 1990 when he was a Heisman Finalist, first team All-Southwest Conference. He won the Southwest Conference Offensive Player of the Year in 1990 and set multiple records at the University of Houston. And two records that stand out for me were in November of 1990 when he threw 11 touchdown passes in one game, 11 against Eastern Washington. And then in December of 1990, he set the NCAA Division I record for most passing yards in a game, 716 passing yards in one game. Now, that's since been surpassed a few years ago, but imagine throwing 700 yards in one game. David Klingler did that in that crazy 1990 season and still ranks in the FBS's top 10 for career TD passes and passing yards. David Klingler now is an associate pastor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary. Played 6 seasons in the NFL, and then suddenly his NFL career is done, and now he's teaching the Bible in seminary. And guess what else? This guy doesn't watch football anymore. He doesn't watch sports. It's a fascinating conversation. You're going to learn a lot about David Klingler. You're going to learn a lot about how to read the Bible. And that's happening right now on Sports Spectrum with David Klingler. Let's take a listen. David Klingler, so good to have you here on Sports Spectrum. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So people hear that name, and some may not recognize it if you're a little bit younger in your 20s or maybe a teenager. But for people who are my age, who grew up as kids in the 80s and the early 90s, that name David Klingler was associated with football. And I was thinking when I heard your name and when Paul Mills, the Oral Roberts head basketball coach who was on our podcast last week, when he mentioned your name, I said, wait a minute, David Klingler, the guy who broke all the records at Houston and first round draft pick with the Bengals, he's teaching on the Bible at Dallas Theological Seminary. That guy, that must be,
right.
You know, it kind of blows my mind. But when I heard that, I was like, that is a fascinating journey to think about. Tell everybody about what you're doing right now, teaching the Bible.
Yeah, so I've been at Dallas Seminary. I went to school, went to seminary in 2000. I didn't have any real aspirations. I just retired. I had elbow surgery, retired. I was training horses and running cows on a cattle ranch, and some Enron executive, if you remember that company, pulled into my ranch and said, "I want to buy your ranch." I said, "It's not for sale," and they made me an offer, and I said, "Well, what all do you want to keep?" And so we sold the ranch. We sold, then the cattle operation sold, and so things were changing really quickly. And I had a friend who said, "Well, what are you going to do next?" His name is Bodie Baucom. I'm sure you've heard of Bodie.
I have heard of Bodie.
And he's another great. He was a great athlete in his day, and Dad played in the NFL, and he played football at Rice and University, and just a sharp guy. And so I met him actually at after my rookie season. I had come back to Houston, and the Houston Oilers back then were having a Bible study, summer Bible study, run by FCA. Mike Myers was the FCA director at that time, and Bodie was teaching the Bible study. And so it was, Cody Carlson and Bruce Matthews and all of these, old names of, great players, and their wives were there. Funny story. I went one week, took my wife. The next week, my younger brother, who was still at the University of Houston and playing quarterback there, he went the next week and took his wife. And so we look real similar. And one of the Oilers' wives says, "What's the deal with this Klingler guy? He keeps bringing different wives every week. What is he, Mormon or something?" So,
That's amazing.
But after that night, Bodie, we got to talk, and he said, "Look, you need to go to seminary." And I'm thinking, well, I don't even know what that is.
Right.
I don't know who would go and why they would go. Fast forward 8 years after I'd retired, and still kept in touch with Bodie, and he said, "You need to go to seminary." And all right, well, where would you go? And so he recommended a couple places, Dallas Seminary being one of them. And so I just wanted to learn the Bible, right? And so I just enrolled, walked into my first class, and Dr. Charles Bayless, who's one of fellow teachers now, fellow professor still, was teaching the class. And I just came home and told my wife, "I want to know the Bible like that." Wow. And, and so that's kind of where it began. Finished at THM in 2004, started teaching in Bible college about that time. Finished my PhD coursework about a year and a half later. And then when I finished my dissertation, became the dean of the Houston campus of Dallas Seminary. Then went to teach at Southwestern, and now back to Dallas Seminary. So I've been teaching in the Bible department at Dallas Seminary for years, and still have the same desire. I just want to know the Bible, right? I don't want to, not trying to, pastor a mega church or anything. I just want to know the Bible and then help others learn the Bible. So it's a perfect fit.
So if I had said to you 30 years ago, when you're doing your thing at the University of Houston, that you'd be teaching the Bible at 52 years old, what do you think you would have said to your 30 years ago self?
I think that probably is about right. I always recognize that football isn't a career unless you're a coach. And if you're a coach, and every football player thinks about being a coach, probably because, people have impacted your life so much. You've got the cover there of Dabo in the background. I mean, the number of kids that you can change their lives, and then they go on to be fathers and leaders of families and leaders in the community and fellow coaches. It's just a huge impact. But it's also a huge sacrifice. And so, so you think about the time requirement, and the people who usually suffer the most are the family. I've got plenty of stories about that, but was offered jobs to coach in the NFL as I was retiring, and just hearing what these coaches had sacrificed. I could probably name on one hand the number of coaches that hadn't been divorced at that level. It just wasn't a price that I was willing to pay. But I always knew that football was not a career. Coaching was a career, and best I could tell, it wasn't a very good one. It was those who had been fired and those who are going to be. That's the old joke. And so I think that what I probably would have thought was I was going to be training horses and, running a ranch, but I always had an interest in learning the Bible. And so that probably wouldn't have been a great shot.
Did you know that at, say, 20 years old, like when you were at Houston, was the desire to learn about the Bible and grow deeper in your faith, or was football kind of the centerpiece? Certainly from the outside looking in, I wasn't a Christian at that time. So you may have been, living out your faith and I would not have even known it. But from the outside looking in as a sports fan, like football seems to be everything. I mean, you were breaking records and doing your thing at Houston.
Yeah. I would say that I was always reflective, always thinking about either this is true or it's not. And if it can't be kind of true.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the definition of truth is it's true all the time. You can't have partial truth. That's just a contradiction in terms.
Yes.
And so either this is all true or none of it's true. If all of it's true, what are the implications of that? If none of it's true, then what are we doing? Right. Yes. I think of Paul's words to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15. We're of all men most to be pitied. I mean, if this isn't true, if Christ isn't raised, what are we doing? Let's, adopt, more of a Jack Sparrow type of philosophy of life and take all you can get and give nothing back. Maybe that's a better approach. So I was always thinking about that. I was always bothered that, and I remember one time distinctly listening to two radio shows back to back, where it just so happened two sermons, kind of two Christian radio shows back to back. And both of the pastors preached on the same passage. And unless you knew it was the same passage, one was at 8:00, one was at 8:30, you wouldn't have known that they were preaching from the same thing. I'm saying, oh, wait a second, somebody says that this passage means this, and someone says it means the exact opposite. Who's right? Because not everybody can be right.
That's right. Yeah.
And then I would think about, people sit around and say, well, what does this passage mean to you? What does this verse mean to you? And I remember thinking, who cares? It doesn't matter what it thinks to you, what you think of it. It only matters what Paul thought of it, or what Peter thought of it, or what, Moses thought of it. What did the author mean by what the author said? That's the authoritative word, not my interpretation of it. Right. So all of these things were kind of banging around in my mind. And what seminary allowed me to do was to speed that thought process up and to interact with faithful men who had, some of them, I think of Dr. Dwight J. Pentecost, who was at Dallas Seminary and taught there for over 60 years. Howard Hendricks taught at the seminary for over 65 years. Yeah. I remember asking one of them one time, when's the last time you heard an original question? And he said, about 35 years ago. Because, the same things just come up. And so these guys had thought long and deeply about many questions. And so it just sped the process up so much more beneficial to me. And so, yeah, I could see myself ending up there, but I didn't have a desire to be a professor for sure, or even a pastor, but I've done both since then, because when you learn the Bible, you learn about the significance and importance of the church, which is Christ's body on earth. And if Christ is preeminent, and if this Bible is true, and the head of the body is not present with the body, but the head, the bridegroom loves the bride, and we claim to love the bridegroom, we ought to love the bride as well. And so care for, protection of, building up of the church should be a natural conclusion to understanding the Bible well.
David Klingler is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. I was a senior that year in 1990, the fall of 1990, when you had that epic junior year in Houston. I'd love to hear your recollections of that season and kind of how you look back on it, and what that year was like for 21-year-old David Klingler. I mean, breaking records, throwing for more than 700 yards in a game, 11 touchdowns in a game, finalist for the Heisman, Offensive Player of the Year in the SWC. I mean, there's so much going on that year for you. when you look back, what was that like to have that experience? Because I know you didn't really play much the few years before, and all of a sudden you're playing, but you're also not just playing, you're dominating on the field.
Right. Yeah. I always joke with people and say I'm the only normal person that I know.
Yeah.
And so how do you define normal? Well, I say, well, it's normal for me. I was in high school. We were running a wishbone offense. I went to college. I was recruited to be a basketball player and a football player. They moved me to free safety early in my career because we were really, we only had one starting free safety. And so they moved me to free safety my redshirt freshman year because they said, we need a good athlete who can go over there and do that. So they sent me over there. And then when I came back at the end of that year, I developed arm problems. And so Andre and I were competing back and forth. And of course, Andre's a great friend and was a great player. Yeah. And so he started my redshirt sophomore year. But in backup time, I threw for 830 some yards and a bunch of touchdowns. And it was just normal. Right. So a normal practice was to throw 400 passes. Wow. And our coaching staff and our support staff would chart every single throw. So you knew how many completions, how many incompletions, how many interceptions. Every stat was taken of every rep that you took. And so, you need to be around 80% execution rate to have success. And so we were doing this all the time. And then I would go into games and have the same success. And so it was just normal. Many games that we threw for a bunch of yards and scored a bunch of points, I'd say most of them, we didn't play particularly well. There was still a lot of room for improvement. And, and so just looking back on those days, that was just normal, right? I had been in an offense where you struggled to gain a yard and this was just, you're throwing the guys wide open everywhere. I mean, you'd watch film and the whole structure of the offense and the way it was designed, it was, nobody was locked into a single route. Everybody was trying to get open, so basically it was like having a bunch of really good athletes and you're playing street ball and you're telling them, okay, y'all get open and I'll get you the ball. Right. And basically that was it with a few rules so that they didn't get open going to the same place. And when I went then to the NFL and went back into a very much more basic offense, it was like going from an offense that had all the answers to offenses that had none and struggled to do really anything. And, and so back then there were just a handful of teams that were really good. And everybody else just showed up to play the handful of really good teams to see who'd win the Super Bowl. And so, that was a giant struggle, going from what began as the run and shoot when I was in college. And by the time that I had graduated from University of Houston, what we were running was just had a few similarities with what most run and shoot teams were doing. Run and shoot teams had just a handful of plays. We had taken those concepts and applied them much more broadly. And we were doing things that even I watch games today and saying they still haven't caught up. There's still some work to do. And John Jenkins, who was the offensive coordinator, was just a mastermind. He had splits down to exact. And if you were a foot off of your split, wide receiver wise, how often does one foot or 1 yard make a difference between a pass being a touchdown and a pass being knocked down?
Yeah.
And so he was just a mad scientist, and he had it figured out. So it was just a great time to be there. And I was surrounded by a bunch of great players, particularly that junior season. We had a great offensive line. And I don't care what offense you're trying to run. If you don't have an offensive line, it doesn't matter.
That's right. Yeah.
They can all look good up there on the board and you can have all the answers on the board. But if your big guys can't block their big guys, it is all for naught. And so we found that out a little bit my senior year.
What was that like going back to your sophomore year to watch Andre Ware have the year that he had, right? And to win the Heisman, and then you kind of come in behind him that had to prepare you because you had that success as well. And in that offense and being able to do so well, which led to you being drafted in the NFL like Andre was. I have to imagine that was something that from a learning process, we talk about mentors and people, especially in our walk with Christ, but as a football player, that had to be something that was, I would imagine something that you could take with you into your junior year, having seen a quarterback have success like he had.
We competed every day from the day we got on campus. My room, we had suites back then. You didn't live in these Taj Mahals that athletes live in now.
Right.
We had Ted Pardee was my roommate. That was Jack Pardee's son. And then right on the other side of the wall was Andre's room. And so we basically lived together. We competed together. Every drill, was a competition. We were always competing. He was a good athlete. I was a good athlete. He was a little bit faster. I could jump higher. I could throw it further. And so when I knew that if he was having success, I could have success because we were so competitive in everything we were doing. And when I saw him drafted as the 7th pick of the first round, I thought, well, okay, we're going to go out there and we're going to just keep running up the same numbers and do the same things. And so it wasn't a shock at all. It was an expectation. And when you're getting, you're getting your butt chewed a little bit for, I remember one game in particular. This was the beginning of my senior season, the first game. We had played the first quarter and we had not done well. And John Jenkins proceeded to tell us that if we didn't get our act together, he was going to pull every one of us, including you, Klingler, he said.
Wow.
And I think that next quarter, I think we went in at halftime. We were down 3-0. I think, as I recall, at the end of the first quarter. At the end of the second quarter, we were up 49-3.
Wow.
So I think that we got the message.
Right? Yeah, 7 touchdowns in one quarter is quite
seven touchdowns in a quarter. And that was, but that was the type of things that this offense was capable of. Every play was designed to score. Every play was designed to not just gain some yards, but to, if you didn't kick an extra point the next play, that play was not a success. And that was the standard, right? And so we failed a lot. And I think about the old saying, if you shoot for perfection, you may miss and hit excellence. And that's probably a good way to describe what we were doing.
You were, you mentioned Andre Ware being selected 7th overall. Well, you were selected 6th overall in 1992 to Cincinnati. Take me to that draft day. What do you remember about that day? I have to imagine you knew you were going to be a high pick, but just thinking where you were 2 years earlier as a backup, even though you had this confidence clearly in the way that you just described that you could do well. Right. Here's your opportunity, right? And the NFL calls, and Cincinnati is the team that selects you. What do you remember about that day and that time?
Well, I remember a couple things about that process. I played, we played, this goes back to Andre's junior season. He won the Heisman, went on into the NFL. We played SMU. And I guess Mel Kiper was at that game. And after that game, he said, Andre Ware is spectacular, but keep your eye on the backup because I think he could be even better. That was really gave me a boost of confidence.
Yeah.
Then we go through the junior season. My junior season, have great success. And then my senior season, in fact, about to come out after my junior season, I'd have gone to New England as the first pick. That's the reason. One of the reasons I didn't come out was because New England was so bad. We think of New England today, and it was, this great organization. Well, back then it was, Victor Kayam, remember the Razors,
rough goings.
Yeah. And they were 1-15 and they were horrible and they sold the team and there was a new coach. And so you just didn't know what was going to happen there. And if hindsight's 20/20, right? If you know that Bill Parcells is coming in and that whole thing's going to turn around, then you jump at that opportunity.
Sure.
But anyway, my senior season then was a rough year. We lost 4 of our 5 starting offensive linemen, and it was a tough season. We couldn't block anybody, and if you're going to try to throw the ball 60 times a game, but you can't block anybody, That's that lopsides games. It's either really good or really bad, right?
Yeah.
And so I was beat up pretty good, um, and so we didn't really know where I was going. Green Bay was probably the most likely place. We thought they were at the time they were sitting at number 3, but other teams were trying to trade up to 1 or 2. But that year, Indianapolis had both the first and second pick of the draft, and during that time, everybody, you got a whole lot. You traded up, you got the quarterback. Well, Indianapolis had Jeff George, and Green Bay figured that they couldn't get me, so they traded for this guy named Favre.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
That worked out for Brett.
Yeah, and for the Packers.
Yeah, and for the Packers, and he went on, of course, to have a great career.
Yeah,
and so, as I recall, they were third. The fourth pick was Cincinnati. They had moved down. They traded with somebody. There were a bunch of teams. Miami was number 5 with Dan Marino. I mean, I think quarterback. And it was actually a shock that the Bengals took me, because Boomer Esiason was in his really the prime of his career. He had been the Super Bowl the league MVP 2 years earlier. And
that's right. Yeah.
So it was just a weird time. Paul Brown had just passed away, the owner of the Bengals, and best I could tell, they got rid of everybody on the team to pay the inheritance tax, and we all, it has not been a good situation since those days.
Yeah.
For the Bengals, and so yeah, it was a shocker of a day, and you just walk in and say, okay, well, this is the next chapter, and as I said before, it was pretty eye-opening to see the difference in what we were trying to do offensively versus what we had done in college.
How would you describe your time in the NFL? Because there's those labels, right? Oh, he was a failure, he was a bust, whatever, that come with, the pundits that are out there in the NFL world. Because if you're a first round draft pick in the NFL, especially in the quarterback position, and it doesn't pan out to turning out to play like Brett Favre did, right? Then you're considered this failure. But when you look at your career, how would you describe your time? I mean, you played for, I think, 6 or 7 seasons. So it's not like you were one and done. And you got to have, a pretty long career, when the average career, I think, is just under 3 years. How would you describe and classify your time as an NFL player?
There's several thoughts there. When you think about sports, if the left tackle can do his job regardless of what anyone else on the field does, right?
Sure.
In sports, almost every position in sports, you can do your job even if everyone else doesn't do theirs. This position is a position that everyone else has to do theirs so that you can do yours. If they don't do yours, then you're trying to make up for theirs and yours, right? So I went from a situation in college where the system had all the answers, and if we just did our part, then you'd have success. And we had guys who could do their part, and so my job was just to kind of put the cherry on the top of the whipped cream, so to speak. Everybody else, I mean, you got receivers running wide open, just get them the ball, right? But when you're not getting blocks and your system doesn't have many answers, and you don't have guys who can get open, it can pile up on you quickly. And so to be a high quarterback draft pick, or running back in some ways is the same way, right? Harold Green was an all-pro 2 years before. 2 years later, he's averaging less than 2 yards a carry. I think it's still the lowest in the history of the NFL over a prolonged season for the lowest yards per carry. Well, he didn't just turn terrible overnight,
Right. Yeah.
And it's not the guys that were theirs fault. I mean, you have an Anthony Munoz who retires, and you've got these all-pro players that are going to other places, and we're filling them in with undrafted rookie free agents. That's tough duty. So that's part of it. I think that's certainly part of it. I think that that the things that were necessary for a run and shoot quarterback to be successful are different things. You had to have a big arm. You had to be able to stretch the field. You had to be able to, throw the ball with high velocity to guys that were open before the window closed. In most of what was going on at that time, it was more anticipation, throw to a spot on time, and let the receiver win, right? Throw him open, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have guys who can get open or can't win, then that sure makes it tough. So there was some of that stuff that was going on, and then you add to that after in between my second and third season, I tore up my rotator cuff and elbow. They tried to change my mechanics. I had elbow surgery after in between my third season and fourth season. Dr. Andrews did elbow surgery, and after surgery, we came out of surgery, and he said, "I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we found the problem. Your cartilage is gone, and it deteriorated, and the bone had decayed. The bad news is you're never going to throw again." I'm thinking, well, okay, well, that's not good. They did a procedure, which now I think they call microfracture, where they try to spur the end of the bone to get it to bleed. Well, it didn't, and so probably the blessing in disguise. I had the surgery in January. I threw my first football July 1st and went to training camp July 18th. And proceeded to break my chin in half a few weeks later in a preseason game against Detroit, and missed 10 weeks. And so really my career was over after the second season. In between that second and third season, when I hurt my arm, it was over. I could have stayed in the league longer as a backup, but I didn't have any desire to do that. As I said before, I think part of that was football's not a career. So I think football is a great tool to teach you great lessons in life: discipline, attention to detail, sacrifice, teamwork. But I was ready to live life, and so it was time to move on.
Let's take a quick break from our Sports Spectrum podcast conversation to tell you a little bit more about our partners and sponsors, Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. Compassion is about releasing kids from poverty in Jesus' name. And over the last year and a half, it's been a very tough go for all of us during this pandemic. But due to COVID-19, 70,000 kids and their families in compassion programs have been left in dire situations, and they need our urgent support. 70,000 is also the capacity of an average pro football stadium. And so here's what's happening. Compassion has partnered with our pro athlete friends to help fill the stadium, to fill a stadium worth of children in need, 70,000 kids in need. Now, you can go to fillthestadium.com right now to learn more and to donate and help these kids and their families during these critical next few months. Every donation helps fill a seat toward a year of needed support, talking about things like essential food, nutritional supplements, hygiene solutions, and medical screenings for COVID-19. Think about that. You can make this difference right now in a kid and their family's life by donating through Compassion at fillthestadium.com. David Klingler is joining us here on Sports Spectrum. It's so good to talk to the former first-round draft pick, former NFL quarterback, and, of course, University of Houston standout. Take me to the crossroads moment, if you had one. I'd be curious to know if you did, where maybe all Christians kind of have to walk through this, right? Where we look at it and we have to make that decision to be all in for Christ.
Right. Absolutely right.
Do you have a moment like that?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So I had grown up, grandparents were Christians. I had, believed the gospel. I knew the gospel. But what I had seen, and this is into college, right? In college, what I was seeing and what I had seen was a bunch of weak, soft, excuse-making men. And I just said, I want, if this is what Christianity is, I want no part of it, right? And I just kind of came to that decision that was, it wasn't for me. And through a few of events that happened, it's like the Lord kind of reached into your life and said, "You want to bet?" And the things just changed, and so that was kind of my all in. This is either true or it's not true, and if it's true, then I'm going to find out what that means. If it's not true, well then I'm not going to waste any more time on this. Yeah, and so that was kind of a moment where I had to decide for myself, and so thankful that life has gone the way it has.
So now, as we fast forward, and you talked about it in the beginning of our conversation about what you're doing now, teaching the Bible, reading the Bible, and studying the Bible. That's two different things, I think. A lot of us are told, read your Bible, pray, fellowship, all of those things.
Right.
But I don't think a lot of us study the Bible. I know that's been, I would say, a struggle for me a little bit. And I watch my brother, who's my second younger brother, the middle brother, who is a PhD just like yourself and who's teaching the Bible. And he's a Bible college professor. And he has a yearning and a desire for people to study the Bible and know God's word in a real way, kind of like what you described. But I'd love to hear your take on why it's important for followers of Christ to not just read, but to truly study God's word and learn more about what the Bible says.
I would say that we don't actually read the Bible.
Okay.
And we have been taught in church to not read the Bible well. What do I mean by that? If you read, let's say that you pick up, Dr. Seuss or some, Cinderella or whatever, and you open it up in the middle, right? Page 9, and you read page 9, and then you say, okay, I'm going to apply page 9 to my life. And then the next day you open it up and it's page 4, right? And then the next, and you don't actually read the whole page. You just take a sentence, right? One sentence off of page 4, and you're going to apply it to your life. Now, you have no idea what the context is, no idea what, who's saying it, what they're saying it, why they're saying it, but you just jerk it out of there and you go, we call you crazy. What are you, nuts? Nobody reads this way, right?
That's right.
But, when I point out to seminary students that stories, the Bible is simply a story, and all stories begin at the beginning and they go to the end, and the middle connects the beginning to the end. You can't just go into a movie, watch one scene, interpret it however you want with your theology, whatever it is that you were told that's the correct theology, and then go apply it to your life. They'll never work that way, right? And so we don't read it. I have yet to find a single student in any of my classes in 20 years of teaching Bible. I'll ask them, do you know John 3:16? They go, oh yeah, I know John 3:16. I say, okay. What about John 3:15? The sentence right before that sentence.
Yeah.
Nobody. Or 3:17 or 3:18, right? Or any of your life verses. Give me your life verse, right, that you've memorized. Okay, what's the verse right before that? They can't tell you. But if I ask you, what's your favorite line in the movie? It's where, I'm a big Tombstone fan. Doc Holliday says whatever he says. I got 2 guns, one for each of you. Well, what is it? What happens right before it? And I can tell you the whole story. I can recite every. Me and my boys. You get us where in a room where Pirates of the Caribbean's playing. I can tell you every line. We all can. We recite it together. And so we don't know the story. We don't. We just have these verses in isolation with no context. And so I think our problem is not that we're not studying the Bible. I think we're not reading it. We're not reading it. And so we're not understanding what the author, Paul, was saying to the Philippians and why Paul was writing this letter to the Philippians. And I don't think that church helps us. The way we preach and teach in church doesn't help us, right? When Paul wrote a letter to the Romans, and here comes the mailman, and he shows up at the doorstep of the church, so to speak. And the pastor of the Church of Rome, First Baptist Church of Rome, probably, or whatever it is, or First Presbyterian,
right,
gathers the congregation. What do you think they did with this? I tell you what they didn't do. I bet that this isn't what happened. Paul said, okay, the pastor says, all right, everybody sit down. Paulos, doulos, Paul, a bondservant. I once knew a bondservant, right? And he launches into his opening illustration. What are you doing? No, they read it.
Yeah.
They read it aloud. How much of it? All of it. And so when Paul gets to the exhortation in chapter, one verse in chapter 6, but then in chapter 12 through chapter into the book, they knew why he was telling them to do what he wanted them to do, because he had told them to believe what they're supposed to believe, right? They read it all at once. You ask students in seminary, what book have you ever read a book of the Bible in one sitting other than Jude or
Right,
Obadiah,
right.
or one of
Philemon.
these one verse or one page books? No, they haven't. Why not? And then that's when they kind of get this moment of, well, yeah, I wonder why, because I wasn't taught to read that way.
Right.
Delete the chapters, get rid of the chapter headings, get rid of the verse numbers, and read Paul's letter to the Philippians. That's how it showed up, and read it all at once. And what he says in chapter 2, which Paul didn't entitle it, now chapter 2, right?
Right. Yeah.
What he says in the last sentence of chapter 1 has direct relation to what he says in the first sentence of chapter 2, right? That's how we read everything, but that's not how we read the Bible.
Man.
And so I think Bible reading is a massive failure in the church.
When you've seen people read the Bible, though, in the way you've described in terms of reading it, what happens? Do they suddenly, it has to, I have to imagine just hearing that has me encouraged to go and read that way.
Absolutely.
It has to do some major transformation work, some major spiritual surgery, if you will, inside someone.
It does, but there's also some tough stuff that comes with that. For example, we were at the DTS, Dallas Seminary's faculty workshop yesterday, and was talking with some of the other Bible professors, and I was just communicating to them that it's taken me 20 years to realize that when Paul says we, he doesn't mean you.
Right, like we as in you and me, David, right?
Yeah, Paul says we, and then he says y'all Corinthians. And never when Paul says we is he including the Corinthians. If he was including the Corinthians, he would say y'all or we all, maybe, something like that.
Yeah.
So when he says we are ambassadors for Christ, he's not calling the Corinthians ambassadors for Christ. Far from it. Right. And so what we do is we go through there and we pick verses that we like. And if we like them, then we associate with them. We say, oh, yeah, that's my life verse. That's for me. So when you realize that Paul tells the Philippians, for example, in chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What he's not saying is y'all can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.
Right.
Okay. Well, that gets me thinking, what is it that Paul says he can do? And are the things that Paul can do things that they can't do? Sometimes. Nobody was like Moses in the Old Testament. In Numbers chapter 12, even God says this. He separates out Miriam and Aaron and says, you're not like Moses. In fact, after Moses, every prophet I will speak to them in dreams and visions, but not with Moses. With Moses, I speak face to face, as a man speaks to his companion.
Yeah.
Well, you're not Moses, right? You go out there and try to kill Goliath, you're going to die. There's only one in Israel that day, and it was the Lord's anointed, who could stand in front of the one who's covered head to toe with serpent garb and strike the serpent on the head and kill him. Only one. And so we need to read the story. And the story has a hero, and it's not me and it's not you.
That's right.
It's Christ. And so how do we relate to Christ? And so the story builds this need for Christ. And all of a sudden, the story, we realize that the story wasn't written by us. And that's important, because now when the author says I or we, he's not talking about me.
Right.
It wasn't written to us. Moses wrote to the Israel. Moses wrote, to this nation that's going to take the land, or the prophets are writing to Israel, or the apostles are writing to the Philippians, and Paul's writing to the Philippians, to Timothy, to Titus. So it wasn't written by us. It wasn't written to us, but it was written for our instruction. We are in the same story. We're just not at the same spot in the same story. And so if we don't know the story, and we don't know what's happened in the past in the story, and where the story's going, then we can't relate to the story. And so
ahead,
I think there's a movement in the church to understand the story nature of the Bible again. I think we've lost that. And I think it's coming back, and I think it's a good thing.
So and we're winding down here in a second, but for people who are listening that are like, all right, where do I start? Because I know people who've read the Bible in a year, and I did that too. And I came away with not a whole lot, just being honest. I'm glad I read
unhelpful.
it. I'm glad I read it.
How did you
in
read
a
it?
year. Right. How did I read it?
Did you do a Bible reading program, or did you?
Yeah, I did. I had an actual Bible that was written in the order of the events taking place, as opposed to, the way a normal Bible would read. Right. And so it took me through Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs, and I would read it every day. And I felt like I was, kind of checking a really awesome box for God and reading it every day, but I didn't come away transformed or changed, because I was like, I don't even know if I remember it, what I was reading. I'm just kind of going through the motions. Yeah. So for those that are listening, how would you recommend starting? Because I've told people in my recommendation, and I'm an elder at my church, so I say, hey, start with the Gospel of John. That's what I usually say to understand.
Because that's what everybody says. Now,
correct, but I would love to hear what you think.
Well, okay. So here's what I try to do. I always try to make an analogy to something other than the Bible to see if it actually makes sense. Because something happens in believers when we come to church, or when we open the Bible, all of a sudden our brains fall out and we quit working. We quit using them, right?
Yeah.
So you say, I'm going to read, this John Grisham story. Okay, here's what you do. Yeah, turn and start and read from page 137 to page 144. Who would do that?
No, nobody would. Yeah, you're right.
Start at the beginning.
So you're saying start Genesis 1 and just go. Yeah,
but don't start Genesis 1 with all of your theology, right? With all of your stuff. Right. Read the story. And so our website, Charlie Bayless and I, one of our other professors, we have a website, and he writes most of it in there. It's called biblicalstory.org.
Okay.
And on that website, you'll find a book that he wrote. Now, this is not a substitute for the Bible, but the serpent and the woman, or the woman and the serpent, I don't remember what it is. But what he does is he retells the story of the Bible in a very simple way, so that when you go back and read it, you see you can kind of track the storyline of the Bible. And then we've got all of our notes for each book of the Bible, seminary notes that we send our seminary students to. So it's a great place to start.
Okay.
That's a great starting place. But
yeah, you're right, because if I watched a movie through, like, I'm a big fan of like the Marvel movies, right? So if I'm watching the Avengers the whole way through, and then I do go back and start at, the 60-minute mark and watch for 15 minutes, I've already read the whole story. So I know what's going to happen, but I can still enjoy or understand, or even go in a little bit more depth in those 15 minutes that I watch, right? This is kind of the parallel you're talking about.
Yeah. And when you watch the movie, authors, directors, storytellers never give you information you don't need. They never do. And they never leave out things that you needed to know. And so every detail in the story every line that's spoken in that movie, there's a reason for it, right? Um, but most of those things you don't recognize until later in the story, or after you watch it the second or the third or the fourth time, you say, I never noticed that before, but I should have noticed that. I should have seen that coming, right?
That's right.
Well, it's the same thing in all narrative literature. It's the same thing. It's how stories work. And so if we will go back to reading Bible as story, we're going to be much better for it.
That's really good. He is David Klingler, now currently associate professor of Bible exposition, right, at Dallas Theological Seminary. Of course, a former first-round draft pick in the NFL and University of Houston standout quarterback. All right, my last question, which completely deviates from anything about the Bible, or maybe it includes the Bible somehow,
Sure.
But I've been asking this now to a lot of our guests recently, a new question. If you could describe where you are today at 52, what would be your perfect sports day? Is there a perfect sports day that David Klingler could experience today? And if so, what would that be?
At 52, I can tell you that the next day after the perfect sports day would include a lot of Advil.
So you're talking about playing here. I was thinking maybe you were talking about watching a sporting event, but
no, I don't watch. No, I don't watch sports. I just don't.
You don't watch any sports? That's fascinating.
I really don't. I have a niece who is she's an All-American softball player. She plays at University of Washington, and so that's the extent of my sports watching.
Yeah.
I'm now a Washington Huskies softball fan.
Right.
And man, they're really good, and kind of had a tough go this last year. But anyway.
So Sunday in the NFL, you're not watching football after church is done or anything?
No. A sports day would be riding a horse.
Riding a horse. Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good day. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that'd be a good day. Yeah,
okay.
That's a good day.
David, this is fantastic. Thanks for spending some time with us. Want to shout out Paul Mills as well from Oral Roberts for connecting us. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. I probably need to take a couple of your classes because I could learn a lot from you. And certainly I'm thinking about my brother too, who's a professor, and learning from him. I do think this is something that I hope everybody listening will be encouraged by, to deepen their reading of the Bible and not just their, pick in the middle of the story and trying to understand it. So thanks for sharing what you did. I really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got I'm actually sitting in our church here at Champion Fellowship in Brenham, Texas. And if you go to championfellowship.org, we've got a podcast that me and the pastor began doing to just help people walk through the Bible, the story of the Bible. And that's been helpful as well. So if that's of interest to you, but thank you. And shout out again to Coach Mills. What a great human being, a great coach, obviously, but just a great person. And,
yeah. A good student too, I presume, right? Because you were his professor.
Yes. And a good thinker. He thinks well, he thinks deeply. And it shows up on the basketball court. He knows why he's doing what he's doing. And that's a lesson for all of us.
That's good. David, thanks again. Championfellowship.org is that website. And he also mentioned biblicalstory.org as well. We'll put those in the show notes so people can check it out. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Okay. Have a good day.
And many thanks to David Klingler, the associate professor of Bible exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary, the former NFL quarterback and first-round draft pick and University of Houston standout quarterback. Thanks to David for joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. I don't know about you, but immediately after I recorded this interview, I started thinking, all right, I need to read the Bible differently. I just do. I mean, I pick a verse and I read the verse and I'm kind of there and that's it. And I do my devotionals and we're going through the book of Luke in my devotionals right now. And that's good. But I need to read the Bible in a different way, I think, after listening to the way David described how we really need to be thinking about the Bible. And he's right. Like, where else would we just automatically jump into the middle of a story and try to understand the whole story from that? We can't. And so I thought that was awesome. I really did. I learned a lot just in that 40 or 50 minutes with David Klingler, and he was great. I really appreciate him joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. We mentioned a couple of websites you can check out, biblicalstory.org, and the other one was championfellowship.org. And Biblical Story, I think, was some of the resources that he has to help you in reading the Bible in the way that he described. And then championfellowship.org was where I think he said he had his podcast that you can check out and listen to as well, championfellowship.org. Thanks to David Klingler for being here on Sports Spectrum. Man, I love that conversation. I wish he was my professor. I might need to enroll just to listen to this guy teach me the Bible each day, each week. So thanks to David for being here on the show. Thanks to you as well for joining us. Again, make sure you check out our website before we say goodbye, sportspectrum.com. That has all of our resources, content, articles, stories, podcasts, all available for free at sportspectrum.com. And then do us one last favor. Make sure you subscribe, download, like, follow, comment, all of those things in regards to this podcast so it gets the word out. And then tell someone about Sports Spectrum. As I've said before, I'll keep saying it. Sports Spectrum, I want it to be a resource for you to share the gospel with someone else. That's really what it comes down to with what we do here. Yes, we want to have entertaining conversations. We want you to read really cool stories, testimonies. We want to bring Jesus back into the sports conversation. But really what we ultimately want to see is people transformed by the saving grace and knowledge of our Savior Jesus. That's really what it's about, the love of Jesus Christ coming in and transforming each of our hearts. And hopefully Sports Spectrum can be one small little cog in that plan of yours or whoever to share about Jesus. So take advantage of that as a resource. Use Sports Spectrum's podcast to tell someone else about God. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.